Palm Sunday story is a perfect opportunity for us to remember exactly what's happening around us. And it's an opportunity for us to believe. This story presents an opportunity for us to be confident in the God that we serve. So I'm really excited about it. This has always been one of my favorite Sundays because when I was a kid, hang on. Palm Sunday, here's the outline of the story. Palm Sunday is the remembrance of the time that Jesus comes into Jerusalem for the last time. He rides in on a donkey, which is weird. People are shouting, which is weird. People put their coats on the ground in front of him, which is weird. People wave palm branches at him, which is weird. People sing to him. That's also weird. That's Palm Sunday. And this is the last time Jesus comes into Jerusalem. And it's a big deal, but it's kind of hard to figure out exactly why. Here's why I love this story as a kid. I grew up in a church that on Palm Sunday, they would give the kids palm branches. And I didn't have a clue what was going on. But what I did know is that became a stick that I could hit people with. And so it was always fun. So I've always had an affinity for Palm Sunday. I will tell you, as I grew a little bit older, what became clear is I did not understand what was going on in Palm Sunday. Why is Jesus on a donkey? The Son of God is on a donkey, and I don't understand why. Why does Jesus get on a donkey at the top of a hill? For me, if I'm going to ride a donkey at all, and I've got a hill in front of me, probably I'm going to ride the donkey up the hill. But Jesus gets on at the top of the hill, which doesn't make sense. And then he rides it for like half a mile. Like, what's the point of going to all the trouble of getting a donkey and then riding it for half a mile downhill? That makes no sense. Why did everybody wave at him? Why were they singing? How did they know to sing all of the same things? The story just doesn't make sense. Some of us are so familiar to us that we don't really stop to think about how really the story just doesn't make that much sense. We're just familiar with it, and so we're comfortable with it, which means we stop asking questions about it, which means that we tend to miss the meaning and power of it. And if you're in the other group, if you're kind of coming into this story a little bit late, then you look at the story from the outside, and it just is all the more difficult to make any sense out of. It wasn't until somebody pointed out to me that this story doesn't actually begin when Jesus gets on a donkey. This story actually begins 1,000 years earlier. 1,000 years before Jesus gets on a donkey. That's when the story of Palm Sunday begins. And if we begin the story there and then show up on Palm Sunday, we'll have a much better sense of not just what is happening, but why it's happening and why that matters for us in this room, in this time, this week. So that's where we're headed this week. I'm going to start 1,000 years before Jesus with a man named David that you may have heard of. David, as in David and Goliath fame. David becomes the king of Israel 1,000 years before Jesus walks the earth. And when he becomes king, he makes a decision that was incredibly important, not only in Israel's history, but it has shaped our world today. The decision that David makes is to establish Jerusalem as the capital city of Israel. He brings the Ark of the Covenant, which is God's own presence, to Jerusalem and says, this is the center. And from that day to this day, Jerusalem has been the center of the Jewish universe. And all that was because David made that decision. It was so famous that Jerusalem became known as the city of David. That's how important David was in the story of Jerusalem. So that event takes place. David establishes Jerusalem as the capital. He's so grateful to God for all that God has done in his life to bring him from being a shepherd boy to the king of Israel, that he says to God one day, thank you. Thank you for everything that you've done. God, you are living in a tent, though, and I want to build you a temple. So let me do that. And God says, thank you, and no. He says, one of your sons can build me a temple. I'm going to give you something better than that. God says to David, you're not going to build me a temple. I'm going to build you a house in the sense of a dynasty. And on the shoulders of one of your descendants, God says to David, on the shoulders of one of your sons, I'm going to establish an eternal throne from which I will never remove my love. That's the promise that God makes to David 1,000 years before Jesus comes along. So the promise of an eternal kingdom becomes this source of hope and waiting and expectation in Israel's life. As David reaches the end of his life, he finds himself on his own deathbed, and he declares that his son Adonijah is going to be the next king of Israel. And when he says that, one of his wives, we're not preaching about that today, one of David's wives comes to David and says, her name was Bathsheba. We're also not preaching about Bathsheba today. If you want to read that story in 2 Samuel 11 and 12, you should go read it, but we're not preaching about that today. Bathsheba shows up and says, sir, I believe you owe me. You made a promise to me. That's what Bathsheba says to David. Bathsheba says, you promised that my son Solomon would be the next king of Israel. And David says, oh, yeah. I forgot about that. Okay, yeah, let's do that. So David says, Adonijah, you're out. He says, Solomon, you're in. And Bathsheba goes away. David calls together his kind of senior leadership council or whatever it was called. And he says, look, I want you to go get my son Solomon. I want you to put him on a donkey. I want you to ride him down to the Gihon spring. And I want you to crown him as the next king of Israel. And Solomon goes on to become the most powerful and wealthiest king in all of Israel's history. But he did not establish an eternal throne. He did build God a temple, but he did not establish an eternal throne. That was not the son of David that God had promised about. Thus begins 1,000 years of waiting. Israel becomes a place of waiting and expectation. When will one of David's sons claim the throne of David and establish this eternal kingdom? When will that happen? Jerusalem itself becomes this place that is pregnant with expectation. Because every time, for folks who lived in Jerusalem and for all of the Jewish folks who traveled to Jerusalem throughout 1,000 years, every time they passed by the Gihon Spring, which is between the Temple Mount and the Mount of Olives, every time they passed by, they could look and they could see that's where Solomon, our greatest king, was crowned. That's where David was promised by God that one of his sons would establish an eternal kingdom. For 1,000 years, the location in which that took place became just packed with meaning and packed with power, the power of hope for a people who had experienced so much tragedy and oppression, so much rebellion, and so much death. They still had this place that they could point to and say, that's where Solomon was crowned. For 1,000 years, they waited. Now fast forward with me, back to the future, back to the story about Jesus. Jesus is coming from Jericho to Jerusalem. This is mere days before he will go to the cross. This is mere days before he will rise from the dead. Before all of that happens, Jesus is headed from Jericho to Jerusalem for the final time. He'll enter the city for the final time. And what's happening around the city at the same time is incredibly important because it's about to be the Passover season in Israel, which means that Jews from all over the world, not just all over Israel, but Jews from all over the world are jam-packed into Jerusalem. And remember, there's no convention center. It's not like they're staying in hotels. There's so many that come that they overwhelm the guest rooms and the guest houses of the people who live in Jerusalem. And so they start to camp out. Right? They camp out in places like the Mount of Olives because that was close to the temple. In fact, I want to land this. I want to land this because I want you to remember this story didn't take place in a galaxy far, far away. This story did not take place floating above the earth. This story did not take place in another realm. This story that we're about to read in Mark chapter 11 took place on real dirt that you can walk today. And I want you to see what it looks like today. We have a map of it that's a Google Earth image map that will show you where the Temple Mount is. That's the Temple Mount right there. It will show you where the Mount of Olives is right here. There's a valley that runs between the temple and the Mount of Olives. There's the Garden of Gethsemane. If you remember that story, that's coming up in a couple days. And here's Bethpage, where our story is going to begin. This right here is where thousands, hundreds and thousands of Jewish folk are camping out, waiting for the Passover celebration. And that Passover celebration recalls God's act of deliverance when he freed the Israelites from Egypt, sent them out of slavery and into freedom, sent them out of death and into life, out of Egypt and into the promised land. That's the story that thousands of people have gathered to remember and to celebrate. That's the story that Jesus is walking into, okay? That's the geography that Jesus is walking into. Now keep that in mind because we're not done yet. I want to read to you out of Mark chapter 11. And I want you to hear what unfolds on what we call
Palm Sunday. This is Mark chapter 11. I'm going to start in verse 7. Then they brought the colt or the donkey to Jesus, and they threw their cloaks on it, and he sat on it. So Jesus gets on a donkey. By the way, this is exactly what Zechariah chapter 9, verse 9 said would happen. It says, Jerusalem, your king will come to you riding on a donkey or on a colt. So this is fulfilling actually the prophecy that was made. This whole story is run through with the notion of a promise fulfilled. Keep that in mind. It's a promise fulfilled. So Jesus gets on the donkey, and many people spread their cloaks on the road, and others spread leafy branches that they had cut in the fields. And then those who went ahead and those who followed, they were all shouting, Hosanna, which means save us. You can go read that in Psalm 118, verse 25. Hosanna, which means save us. Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the coming kingdom of our ancestor David. Hosanna in the highest heaven. All the questions come up right here. Okay, why are we spreading cloaks on the ground? It's kind of akin to the red carpet. If somebody rolls a red carpet out in front of you, what do you automatically assume about that occasion? That there is some sort of celebration, there is some sort of honoring. We're honoring the people on the red carpet. That's what the cloaks on the ground are. Why are we waving leafy branches? Because these are signs of independence and freedom. Why is Jesus on a donkey? Because in this culture, this is what a conquering king does. This is what a victorious king does. And how does everybody know to yell out at the same time, Hosanna, blessed is the one who's coming in the name of the Lord. Blessed is the one who's fulfilling the kingdom of our ancestor David. How would everybody know all of that? Here's how. You already know now. You already know. All these people have gathered in from all over Israel, including the northern part of Israel, which is a very poor part of Israel. It also happens to be where Jesus spent most of his time. All those people are camping on the Mount of Olives. How did they know it was Jesus? Because Jesus has been walking around them for the last 3 years. And why do they see him as a coming king? Has somebody told them, hey, the king is coming, let's act like he's a king? No. They see a replayed event. This is what I mean by that. We have another map for you that makes it even clearer. When Solomon was put on a donkey, when Solomon was crowned the king of Israel at the Gihon Spring, it happens right here. Notice that Jesus gets on a donkey right here at the top of the mountain at Bethpage, because that's the city limits for all intents and purposes of Jerusalem. The prophecy says your king will come into the city on a donkey. Jesus gets on a donkey right here, rides down the Mount of Olives in the same direction as the Gihon Spring. They've seen this event before. That's how they know what Jesus is up to. They have seen a king riding on a donkey down the Mount of Olives to the Gihon Spring to be crowned as the king of Israel. What Jesus is doing is replaying this event from Israel's history and fulfilling it. Because what Jesus is after is not the building of a temple. What Jesus is after is the establishment of an eternal throne. Jesus is the son of David, right? We hear that in Jesus' birth narratives and the genealogy that we hear from Joseph. Jesus is the son of David who is riding into the city of David, which is Jerusalem, to claim the throne of David that was prophesied about, that was promised to David all the way back in 2 Samuel chapter 7, 1,000 years before this event happened. Jesus is the son of David riding into the city of David, claiming the throne of David. And here's the kicker. Jesus is celebrated and proclaimed king. And the worst, the hardest, the darkest days were yet to come. That is the power of this story, because the cross is days away, right? The trial, the suffering, and the crucifixion, the death of Jesus are yet to come, and yet Jesus is still proclaimed king. Because no matter what lays behind, no matter what lies ahead, Jesus is still king. Right? What Jesus is king does not mean is that the suffering and the pain and the death of the cross don't happen. And for us, the reality that Jesus is our king does not eliminate suffering, the suffering of storms, the suffering at our own hands, the suffering that we cause toward each other. Jesus as king does not eliminate all of that stuff. Jesus as king means that the outcome, the ultimate end has been secured. That the end of this story is not in doubt. That suffering and pain and death and trial and challenge will not have the last word. They will not be the last day because Jesus is still King. That's Palm Sunday. Even in the face of the cross, we celebrate that Jesus has come to establish an eternal throne from which God has already said he will never remove his love from his kingdom, from his people, from his family. He will never remove his love because Jesus has come. The Son of David has come into the city of David to claim the throne of David and initiate God's kingdom on earth. So friends, this week begins Holy Week, what we in the church tend to call Holy Week, this week leading up to Easter. And my encouragement to you is wave a palm branch. Perhaps not literally, because people will think you're bizarre, but perhaps verbally, perhaps by your action, by your way of life. Wave a palm branch this week, not for yourself, because we are not king. Wave a palm branch for Christ, because he is king. And because somebody in your life is struggling because they're wondering whether the darkest day and the hardest day will have the last word in their life, whether that will be the last day in their life. Somebody in your life is wondering whether the pain and the suffering that tends to happen in life is really all there is. And they need somebody like you to wave some kind of palm branch that acknowledges for them that Christ is king, not the kind of king that's domineering, not the kind of king that lords it over his people, not the kind of king that sacrifices his people for his own sake, but the opposite. Somebody in your life needs to hear that Christ is king, the kind of king that is full of mercy and justice, the kind of king that is full of care and compassion and tenderness for his people, particularly when they are suffering, the kind of king that provides a life both here and eternal for his people. Somebody in your life needs you to wave a palm branch this week because they need to hear perhaps not just this story, but perhaps they need to hear what God has done in your life and why you can cling to hope and experience even joy in the midst of all of life's suffering, in the midst of all of life's challenges and pain and even death. They need you to share that story. This is the week that we join the crowd on the Mount of Olives, yelling out, Hosanna, which means save us. Hosanna to the Son of David, who comes to the city of David to claim the throne of David and God's eternal kingdom.